Thank you very much. It's great to be here today. So I'm Lovell Pratt, the Marine Protection and Policy Director at Friends of the San Juans. So Friends of the San Juans' mission is to bring people and nature together to protect the San Juan Islands and the Salish Sea through science, law, policy, and education. During this presentation, I'll include several examples of vessel traffic impacts to southern resident killer whales. In 2001, Friends of the San Juans was a co-petitioner that led to the federal listing of southern residents as an endangered species, and their protection and recovery continues to be one of our top priorities. So I'll be focusing on the risks and impacts from shipping, and I'm also going to get to the opportunities there are to reduce and eliminate shipping impacts and to take action to protect the Salish Sea. Shipping risks are impacts that could occur if there's an accident. In addition to oil spills and ship strikes, other risks include chemical and hazardous material spills, cargo and container spills, release of ballast water containing aquatic invasive species. Those are just some examples. Shipping impacts, as compared to shipping risks, occur even when ships are operating safely. So underwater noise and scrubber discharges aren't the only impacts. There's also tribal treaty rights impacts, air pollution, which contributes to ocean acidification, greenhouse gas emissions, and more. So to talk about the shipping impacts and risks in the Salish Sea, we need to start with this view of the entire Salish Sea ecosystem. From this view, we can see the interconnectedness of this multi-nation region that includes a boundary between the United States and Canada. So how many of you have read The State of the Salish Sea? Raise your hands. Okay, that really should be required reading here. And for those of you who have, you know that local population growth and urbanization are primary threats to this ecosystem. Population growth is also a primary driver in the growth of vessel traffic. So as population grows, so will the demand for global freight. So these aren't the indigenous names of these unceded waters, but they're the place names I'll use in this presentation when I refer to specific waterways in the Salish Sea. So I just wanted to provide this map for those of you who aren't familiar with the local geography. And looking at the same central of the Salish Sea image again, we can see the vessel traffic lanes for large commercial ships that share the Salish Sea along with all the whales and many other marine mammals and all forms of aquatic and nearshore life, including all of us who call this place home. The vessel traffic is cooperatively managed by the US and Canadian Coast Guards. The entire Strait of Juan de Fuca on both sides of the border is managed by the US Coast Guard, and the vessel traffic in Harrow Strait, Turnpoint, Boundary Pass, and Lower Georgia Strait on both sides of the US-Canadian border is managed by the Canadian Coast Guard. So back in 2009, almost 60% of the commercial ships entering the Salish Sea were destined for Washington state ports. These are the red bars on the graph. Since 2009, that trend has flipped, and with the projected increase in vessel traffic, an even greater percentage of vessel traffic entering the Salish Sea will be bound for Canadian ports, the blue bars. So there's been an 11% increase in the percentage of traffic transiting to and from British Columbia since 2009. And the majority of ships transiting to and from ports in British Columbia go through Harrow Strait, Turnpoint, and Boundary Pass. So Friends of the San Juans Salish Sea Vessel Traffic Projection Report and the infographic you see here informs the public and decision makers on both sides of the border about projects throughout the Salish Sea and their cumulative increases in vessel traffic. The 2024 update documents 23 new or expanding terminal and refinery projects that have been proposed or permitted or were recently completed. 10 of the 23 projects would potentially add at least 2005 annual ocean-going vessel transits to and from Salish Sea ports. And that's an 18% increase in the large ocean-going commercial vessel traffic as compared with 2023 transits. Friends of the San Juans monitors project proposals throughout the Salish Sea, and we oppose projects that could increase vessel traffic. We're not always successful engaging in the permitting process, but we litigate when needed, and we've also had success with settlement agreements that prevented additional vessel traffic. I'll be focusing on two projects in Canada that account for over 60% of the projected increase in vessel traffic. Roberts Bank Terminal 2, which is number 9 on this map, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project, number 5. So these two projects combined would increase vessel traffic going to and from Canada by over 21%. So Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is where this red arrow is pointing at the bottom of the map. And I just wanted to show you this map of the Port of Vancouver. It's Canada's largest port with 29 major terminals and extends from Roberts Bank on the US-Canadian border up to and including the Fraser River and the Burrard Inlet. And the bottom of the map, that dotted line you can barely see, is the US-Canadian border. Both the Canadian provincial and federal governments have permitted the Port of Vancouver's proposal for a new container ship terminal. And this would be a new 267-acre offshore overwater terminal in the Fraser River Delta, less than a mile from the US-Canadian border. And this zooms in just on a closer look at where that proposed Terminal 2 would be. In spite of widespread opposition and numerous lawsuits, this project has received both the federal and provincial permits. And the permit approvals ignored the project's lasting and irreversible environmental impacts, including threats to the survival of the southern resident killer whales and wild salmon. The Canadian federal government's own scientists told decision makers that Roberts Bank Terminal 2 would result in significant adverse environmental impacts that would be immediate, permanent, irreversible, continuous, and impacts that cannot be mitigated. If a fisheries authorization is obtained and the final investment decision is affirmative, the construction is expected to begin in the late 2020s with completion in the mid-2030s. Friends of the San Juans has opposed this project since 2015. We submitted comments and went to Canada to testify in person at a hearing. And when it was clear that the project was going to be approved, Friends asked that if it was going to be approved to require permit conditions, including having an emergency response towing vessel for Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass, and prohibiting the use of heavy fuel oil on the container ships that would call at the port. So this project would add 520 additional container ship transits each year and accommodate the ultra-large container ships that can carry up to 24,000 20-foot equivalent unit containers, or TEUs. These ships also carry millions of gallons of propulsion fuel. Some of you might remember the Zim Kingston container ship that caught fire just off of Victoria, British Columbia, back in 2021. And this is a relatively small container ship with less than 5,000 TEUs and that's a picture of it on the left. And then the Benjamin Franklin is just an example of a large container ship. This is an 18,000 TEU container ship, and that carries 4.5 million gallons or more of propulsion fuel. Container ships, no matter how large they are not required to have tug escorts. So now we'll talk about the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. And this arrow points to where it is in the Port of Vancouver, the Westridge Terminal in Burnaby, British Columbia. And Trans Mountain is owned by Canada. This map shows the extent of the project. It was completed in May, and the bitumen or tar sands, which are basically oily sand, is mined in Alberta, where the pipeline begins. And the bitumen is mixed with diluents, so it can be transported by pipeline and loaded onto a ship. Thus the name diluted bitumen for this heavy crude oil. A diluted bitumen spill would be extremely impactful and the impacts to environmental, cultural, and economic resources and treaty rights would be devastating. This map also shows the 6 refineries in the Salish Sea, 1 in British Columbia, and 5 in Washington State. Exports are expected to reach 37 tank vessels each month. The tug escorts are only required for laden tankers. These are the westbound tankers exporting the Canadian tar sands crude oil. Tankers, so those tankers will have tug escorts, but the tankers entering the Salish Sea that have over 800,000 gallons of propulsion fuel on board will not. This is the tanker traffic route that was included in the application. And the diluted bitumen exports, the heavy crude oil exports to California, Alaska, and Asia do use this route. However, there's tanker traffic that goes directly to Washington State refineries and anchorage areas. And so these are just a couple of screenshots of vessel traffic transiting from the Burnaby facility to refineries and anchorages in Washington State. So the Trans Mountain tankers' use of Washington State anchorage areas while waiting for a berth at the Westridge terminal is increasing accident and oil spill risk here in Washington State. Between May and November, shipments of the heavy crude oil averaged 309 million barrels per day. And almost all of that heavy diluted bitumen crude oil was transported by tanker. Regardless of the destination, you can see on this color-coded map the destination since May of the heavy crude oil. Regardless of the destination, all of this crude oil gets transported through the Salish Sea. So 309 million barrels each day is a staggering amount. If you can imagine an Olympic-sized swimming pool, which holds about 660,430 gallons of water, then Trans Mountain is exporting 19,651 Olympic-sized swimming pools of heavy crude oil through these waters each day. I'm now going to show you a 3-dimensional representation of oil spill risk from the 2015 Vessel Traffic Risk Assessment. This isn't current data, but I think it's still relevant in showing how this increase in tanker traffic is increasing oil spill risk. And if you can just take a minute, what you're seeing on this slide is the oil spill risk given the existing vessel traffic in 2015. And then this slide shows the increase in oil spill risk. You can see those additional spikes in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass when you add the tanker traffic. The KM was Kinder Morgan, which is the old name for the project, but this is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project tanker traffic that shows an increase in oil spill risk. And I'll just go back and forth a couple of times, the traffic before Trans Mountain, and then the oil spill risk with Trans Mountain. And then if you recall, we were talking about Roberts Bank Terminal 2 for container ships. According to the Department of Ecology, container ships have the highest oil spill risk metrics. See, you look at the bottom of this slide as compared to other types of ships. So, and we're going to be talking later about the use of scrubbers, and container ships that use scrubbers can continue to use heavy fuel oil for propulsion, which would cause significant damage if there was a spill of heavy fuel oil. So oil spill impacts. You might have seen this recent study. The environmental, cultural, and economic impacts from a major oil spill would be devastating and long-lasting. This study found significant declines in sperm whales, up to 31%, beaked whales up to 83%, and dolphins up to 43% that correlate with the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This slide shows NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration's 2024 responses. And they noted that Alaska and Washington State had the most responses in the US, 27 each. And then this slide shows NOAA's 2024 responses to oil and chemical spills in this region. As vessel traffic increases, so does the risk of accidents and oil spills. In 2006, the Washington State Department of Ecology quantified the economic impacts of a large spill at $10.8 billion and 165,000 jobs. So the main message I want to give here is that oil spill prevention is critical and the highest priority. An emergency response towing vessel is needed to address the accident and oil spill risk of existing vessel traffic in the Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass region. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and Roberts Bank Terminal 2 projects just exacerbate the need for that additional emergency response towing vessel. So what we're seeing here is a picture of the emergency response towing vessel at Nia Bay. This is at the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And it's a proven oil spill prevention asset. It's been successfully deployed to assist vessels in distress. There's been 90 callouts since 1999. And you can see that on this map here. Ships calling on Washington state ports pay for the Nia Bay emergency response towing vessel to be on call 24/7, 365 days a year. And it's available, though, to any vessel that's in distress. However, the Nia Bay emergency response towing vessel isn't able to effectively respond to spills, respond to vessels in distress in the Harrow Strait Boundary Pass region. This map from the 2015 Vessel Traffic Risk Assessment shows the areas in green where the Nia Bay emergency response towing vessel can successfully respond to vessels in distress. And you can see, in comparison with this earlier map, that that corresponds with the actual callouts. So this study shows that an emergency response towing vessel stationed at either Sydney, British Columbia, or Roach Harbor, Washington, would be effective in responding to vessels in distress. Given that ships going to Washington state ports pay for the Nia Bay ERTV that benefits all vessel traffic, it makes sense for Canada and ships going to and from Canada to pay for this additional emergency response towing vessel. And while you study this slide, I just want to give a shout out to our former Governor, Jay Inslee, who has been an amazing advocate for the protection of the Salish Sea ecosystem. And while Governor Jay Inslee sent a letter to the Consulate General of Canada with a recommendation to station additional towing capacity in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass. So you may have seen this recent article on a study that quantified the risk of ship strikes worldwide for blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, and sperm whales. And this next slide I'm going to show you has a picture of a southern resident killer whale that may have died from a vessel strike. So just close your eyes for a minute if you don't want to see that. So another study, the study referenced here, that was published in 2020 included findings that the risk of vessel strikes leading to the death of southern residents may be an underappreciated but important threat to the population of these critically endangered killer whales. Studies have found that a lethal vessel strike on a single individual southern resident could have significant adverse population consequences. So now I'm going to talk about shipping impacts, and we'll start with underwater noise. Projects that increase vessel traffic are receiving permits without any evaluation of the Salish Sea's cumulative vessel traffic carrying capacity, such as the carrying capacity for underwater vessel noise. Underwater noise disrupts the southern residents' forage. It impacts their ability to successfully hunt and communicate. And underwater noise has been identified as one of the main threats to the critically endangered southern resident killer whale's survival. Transport Canada is working with ship operators in Canadian waters to develop and implement noise management plans to reduce overall underwater noise. And this is something we should be doing on this side of the border as well. The Port of Vancouver's ECHO, or Enhanced Cetacean Habitat and Observation Program, is reducing vessel speeds in these areas shown on the map here. And it both reduces underwater noise and the risk of vessel strikes. Vessel slowdowns are seasonal to coincide with when the southern residents are present. Slowing down ships also reduces pollution for marine life and shoreside communities, and it reduces the emissions of greenhouse gases. The 2023 Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass slowdown successfully reduced underwater noise intensity by up to 50%, or 3 decibels, and the program's slowdowns can reduce the proportion of risk of whale strikes to humpbacks and fin whales by 18 to 27%. And across all the slowdown areas and ship types, the slowdowns reduced air emissions by 14%. So Quiet Sound in Washington State was modeled on the ECHO program and has vessel slowdown areas south of Admiralty Inlet. Other ways to reduce underwater noise is for ships to be accredited as quiet by a ship classification society, or at the very least, to establish a process to ensure that ships aren't inordinately loud. Okay, now we're going to talk about exhaust gas cleaning systems, better known as scrubbers. And this is another impact from the ships that do use scrubbers. In this slide here, we see diagrams of open loop scrubbers and closed loop scrubbers. And you can see in the open loop scrubbers that seawater goes in and it's used to spray the exhaust, and it removes the highly acidic sulfur oxides and other chemical pollutants from the ship's smokestacks and continuously discharges this pollution overboard whenever the engines are running. Closed loop scrubbers recirculate chemically treated scrubber wash water. However, bleed off is also discharged overboard. And then there are hybrid systems that can toggle between open loop and closed loop. And this pie chart here shows that 80% of scrubbers are open loop, and they continuously discharge toxic pollutants directly into the Salish Sea or all marine waters. And scrubber use is increasing exponentially. The Canadian government found that on Canada's Pacific coast, which includes the transboundary Salish Sea, scrubber discharges totaled over 97.3 million US tons in 2022, and that was nearly double the amount that was discharged in 2019. So this is a growing problem. So this is a great infographic, and there's a lot of information going on here, so I'll just give you some time to study it. And let me see if this pointer works. I just have to point out on the map here, see these are copepods. And copepods are these tiny but significant animal planktons. And they are just absolutely critical to the marine food web. And even at extremely low concentrations, just 0.001% scrubber wash water pollution, they can severely impact copepod populations. And that could mean that the entire food web would be impacted. Scrubber discharges are highly toxic, up to 100,000 times more acidic than surrounding waters. And ocean acidification is already impacting the region's wild and commercial shellfish and the marine ecosystem, and scrubber pollution is just making that worse. Scrubber pollution includes heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, nitrates, nitrites, sulfates, and particulate matter. So the heavy metal and the PAHs are especially concerning given their ability to persist in the marine environment and accumulate within marine species. So these PAHs and these heavy metals, they both bioaccumulate within species and they biomagnify up the food chain. So those of us at the top of the food chain, like humans, like southern resident killer whales, we're especially impacted. PAH contamination and accumulation in the critically endangered southern residents further threatens their survival. And these are especially impactful to indigenous and subsistence subsistence fishing communities. PAH exposure has been linked to DNA damage, endocrine disruption, developmental abnormalities, lung deficiencies such as asthma, and disruptive cognitive development. And the good news is, now that you're thoroughly discouraged by all this information about scrubbers, that you just need to know that scrubber pollution is preventable. It's one of the few times you can say there's a simple solution to this pollution. There's a bill that was just introduced in the state legislature this week in both the House and Senate, and it would require ships to use emission compliant low sulfur fuels, which would eliminate the use of scrubbers. So scrubbers, they're optional for ships to use, and the majority of ships actually use emission compliant low sulfur fuels. And the vessels that use scrubbers can switch to the low sulfur fuels. They don't have to install new equipment. They don't have to retrofit existing equipment. There's no barriers that would keep shippers from adopting a requirement to use cleaner fuels. There's already some kind of restriction or ban on scrubbers in 17 European Union countries, the United Kingdom, and scrubber discharges are banned in the state of Connecticut, and the low sulfur fuels are required in California and have been for over a decade. So ships are already complying with these requirements elsewhere. So it's important to acknowledge that the advantage to using scrubber systems is the lower cost of the bunker fuel, the heavy fuel oil, that requires the use of scrubbers as compared with the emission compliant low sulfur fuels. But any cost savings to vessel owners and operators are far outweighed by the costs associated with scrubber discharge impacts to water quality, public health, endangered species, aquaculture, commercial, recreation, and cultural harvests of wild shellfish and fish, ecotourism, and many other marine economies, and of course, the shared waters of the Salish Sea. So I just found out today that there are hearings for this bill next week in both the House and Senate. And so now for what you can do. One thing that you can do is sign up for action alerts. If you want to get out your phones to use these QR codes, and they're also posted with handouts at the table where you walked in. And the top handout is to sign up for action alerts, and we'll be sending out an action alert tomorrow to let you know about the hearings that are going to take place next week for the legislation that would require the use of low sulfur fuels. And it's really simple to engage with the legislature and show your support for legislation. And you can just do it online. It takes like a minute to just sign in and show your support for a bill. And there are other bills that we'll be providing action alerts on. And we'll also, if there's ever an opportunity to advocate for an additional emergency response towing vessel in Haro Strait or Boundary Pass, we'll have action alerts for that too. And then the QR code at the bottom here is where you can learn more about the Salish Sea vessel traffic projections. There's a link to the report and the infographic there. And I want to give a huge thanks to all of our members and funders who support the Friends of the San Juans and our work to protect the Salish Sea. I'm really honored to be able to provide this list of great foundations and the sovereign nations who support our work. And I hope I left plenty of time for questions, because I'd love to hear your questions. Yes.
Two-part question. Back in '89, there was the oil spill in Alaska.
Yep.
I wanted to ask you, first of all, how much oil came down to Vancouver? And the second question, as far as security, all these ports with, fuel fires and security, do you all have security in place all times for anything as far as fuel fires, attacks, or anything as far as country, or anything as far as in place, as far as commerce and
Great, that's a great question. So I'll repeat it for the people online. So the question was asking about the oil spill that happened the Exxon Valdez spill that happened in Alaska in 1989 and whether we had any impacts from that spill here. Is that correct? And then the other part of the question was asking about preparedness for like oil spill response preparedness and fire preparedness. So so the first question about the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill up in Alaska, that oil spill did not come to Washington state waters, to the Salish Sea. It was hugely impactful to the region of Alaska, and that impact, has gone on for years, and to the environment and to the communities there. And there were, just one example of the impacts is there were two groups of killer whales in the vicinity of the spill, and one of those groups is essentially extinct. There are just a couple of members that are still alive as far as I know, but there's been no new offspring from that group ever since the spill occurred. And when the final members of that group die, that group will be extinct. Another group that was in the vicinity of the spill, it took a long time before there were any new offspring. It looks like that group will recover, but those impacts are long lasting. And we saw the slide earlier about the impacts to various species of whales in the Gulf, where the 2010 BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred. And that study is showing that the impacts from that spill are much longer lasting than was initially expected. And then in terms of oil spill response, so the preparedness requirements. So in Washington state, there are requirements for being prepared for an oil spill. They call that oil spill contingency plan requirements. And every 5 years, those state rules are updated. And it just so happens that next year will be the year when they have a rulemaking to update those requirements. And this year, there's a process that initiates at a meeting on, I think it's February 4th or 5th. And if you want to email, I can send you the information. But they're going to do what's called a best available protection process, where they look at existing state requirements. They try to identify where are their gaps, where are their deficiencies, and what might be the updates that we need to do in the coming rulemaking next year. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd be happy to send that information and connect you with staff at the state that are working on that. Any other questions? Sure.
So how widespread is scrubber use in what percentage of vessels?
Yeah, okay, really good question. So the question is, what percentage of vessels in the Salish Sea use scrubbers? So I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that worldwide, probably about 5% of ships worldwide use scrubbers. And so it's a small percentage, but as you saw in that slide, it's a growing percentage. And even just the existing traffic that uses scrubbers is causing severe environmental damage by the scrubber pollution that is being discharged into the waters. But it is a small minority. So most ships comply with the global treaty on sulfur content in fuels by using the low sulfur fuels. Okay.
So if there's a lot, to like try to keep ships from using these scrubbers, what's causing an increase? Are there certain countries or companies that are just like skirting it because they can, or because not every country follows the guidelines?
Okay, so the question is, why are ships? What's the motivation for ships to use scrubbers? Is that a good summary?
Yeah, like basically.
Okay, so there's a global treaty that's overseen by the International Maritime Organization that has established the sulfur content in fuels. And there's also what's called a North American Emission Control Area that extends 200 miles out from North America. And in that emission control area, the sulfur content requirements are even better, like it has to be lower. And that's all great, but somehow they came up with this alternative where you could use scrubbers to comply with the low sulfur emission requirements and still use that bunker fuel, that heavy fuel oil. So And those laws in the US are overseen by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And so they have certain requirements for the kinds of discharges that are allowed. But the main motivator, I think, in terms of using scrubbers, installing scrubbers and using scrubbers is there's an initial cost to the equipment and the installation, but after the payback period, after, when you break even, I mean, the cost of the heavy bunker fuel oil is much less than the emission compliant low sulfur fuel. So it's the cost savings in the longer term. Yeah.
So you have over 60 people in the audience
Oh,
online. So
yeah.
that's great. You have a question actually from your colleague Cynthia Ellison. She's asking, so the scrubbers were made to reduce air pollution, but no one thought dumping in the ocean would be a problem. Was it the dilution is the solution mindset that we saw in the 1970s?
That's a great question. So, do I need to repeat it too? Yeah. Okay, so the question is from online is, oh my gosh. So question about, didn't people think it was a bad idea to transfer the pollution that would go into the air, into the ocean? And was the mindset that was something that people thought of in earlier times that dilution is the solution, like it's okay to just dump it in the ocean, it's a great big ocean, no problem. And is that a fair summary? Okay. So I really don't know. I mean, it's hard to imagine why they thought it would be okay to, take a pollution that would otherwise go into the air and dump it into the marine waters. And what I also want to just share is that ships that continue to use the heavy fuel oil and use scrubbers, their emissions are worse, even with the scrubbers, the emissions are worse than the ships that are using the low sulfur fuel. So it's not really solving the emission problem either. And that's a real concern. That's a real problem. Was there any other questions online you wanted to? Okay, there was someone in the back here that, okay, go for it. How are what enforced? Oh, yeah. So the question was about the ECHO program and the quiet sounds vessel slowdown programs and asking how is that enforced? And actually, it's a voluntary program, so there's no enforcement, but it's monitored and they actually have a high compliance rate from the ships. So they can look at the data that shows how fast the ships are going and they can document the percentage of ships that are participating. And both of those organizations have reports that document the percentage of ships that participate each year in the vessel slowdowns. Yes.
From your slide from the Salish Sea vessel traffic projections, and it says here for the Port of Bellingham to be announced. Are you familiar or do you know what's happening recently with Port of Bellingham, or have you?
So I know that the Port of Bellingham received a grant a few years ago to do some upgrades. Okay.
For training to do all the shipping containers and shop and the cars.
Yeah, there is the intent to have a program where there's funding from the federal government to take traffic off the highways or off the rail lines and put it on ships. And so this was a grant that the Port of Bellingham got to establish a way to use barge traffic between Bellingham and San Diego, California. And I as far as I know, that project hasn't begun yet, but they've done a lot of improvements so that it could go into effect. Is that great? Yeah, I'd love to learn more. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Another online question. Does Friends of the San Juans advocate for sustainable marine fuels such as non-fossil fuel-based fuels?
Okay, so the question is, does Friends of the San Juans advocate for sustainable fuels, so non-fossil fuel-based fuels? And the answer would be yes, with a caveat that there are fuels that are presented as renewable or green that maybe aren't entirely renewable or green. So there's that. And then there's also just, remember, when we talked about vessel traffic impacts, we talked about underwater noise. So that's a factor to consider and that might or might not change depending on the fuel source. But certainly, yeah, moving in the direction of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and all the pollution associated with the fuels that we currently have available, this is a really important step to yeah. Oh, Ginny.
So if we're talking about underwater noise and the mechanisms for using slowdown as an approach, but it seems like there's also a lot of technologies that are helping to make ships less noisy. Like I saw the BC ferry system has some really ambitious goals, has been investing a lot in decreasing their underwater noise. Could you speak a little bit about what else you're seeing happening in the industry?
Yeah, great question. So this is a question about, are there other technologies, other ways to reduce underwater noise in addition to the vessel slowdown trials or the vessel slowdowns that I talked about in the presentation? And I think what's great about the project that Transport Canada is working on is setting up monitoring stations to actually monitor the noise of the different vessels. And there was a study that was done some years ago, and it found that I hope I get this right. I think the finding in the study was that 15% of the vessels were generating a huge percentage of noise. So these were inordinately loud vessels, like they had a bent propeller or they had something that made them just extremely loud. And so they were, like if you just removed those, they called them gross polluters. If you just remove those gross polluters from the vessel traffic, it would significantly reduce noise. So one thing is just to have an expectation or a requirement that ships have to be maintained so that they aren't noisier than they need to be. So that would make a big difference. But there are ways that ships can use technologies to be even quieter. So that certification program for being quiet, like they have research vessels that are designed to be almost silent because that's what they have to be to do the research they do. So the technology is out there. It's just it needs the willingness or maybe the requirements to make it happen. Great question. Yes.
So it sounds like when the Canadian government did their impact assessment on the expansion of the shipping terminal up in Tsawwassen, it got a big F. So there's no way to mitigate the impacts of the increased vessel traffic in the area. How is it legal?
Yeah, that is such a good question, right? Okay. And I think what I want to say about this project, Roberts Bank Terminal 2, I mean, this would be building like an island in the middle of the water, right? So it's not just the increase in vessel traffic, it's this construction of a terminal on the water in this critical habitat, right there in the Fraser Delta. And this is, this is a hugely important area for migratory birds. I should have a link to the Sea Doc Society did this great film on the birds that would be severely impacted by the construction of this project. And they rely on the food they get as they make their way on their migration right there. So yeah, I think the challenge is that often it's the case that even with documentation of incredible impacts, it's hard to say no to these projects. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is another example for sure.
Highest authority of Canada essentially said this project can't happen. So I'm really curious to learn how it is happening.
Yeah.
You got a source here.
I know, really, we need to get you on the mic, Natalie. Yeah, I should.
I was actually going to ask about an environmental impact assessment question too, because I'm interested in that topic, as you know. I was really intrigued by your map of, the anchorages and the transits through Washington state waters that weren't part of the environmental impact assessment. How, is there any form of environmental impact assessment, oversight, enforcement at all for those kinds of transboundary impacts that's taken into consideration with these projects coming up the pipeline?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question about environmental assessments that are done with a project application that says it's going to be a certain way. And then in fact, When it's completed, it's something else. Is there any sort of oversight or subsequent assessment that gets done? And I think the simple answer is no. And I mean, I haven't seen, I mean, that hasn't happened. And I haven't been able to find any vehicle to make that happen, but it's true that the project is not as it was presented. So this is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project and the tanker traffic. I think actually one of the most environmentally impactful components of the project now that it's been completed and is in operation is Trans Mountain has what they call it a waiting area. And just off the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, you can see tankers out there just waiting to go in to get a berth. And sometimes they're even partially laden. You know, they've delivered some of their load to a refinery in Washington State, and then they go out and they just like do these loop-de-loops out. Just if you go to the website that has the Salish Sea Vessel Traffic Projections Report, you'll see a screenshot of that. And so that's really concerning because out when they get past the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, they aren't required to have tug escorts anymore. And tug escorts are a great oil spill prevention safety measure. So the tug escorts are there. So if the ship loses steerage or loses propulsion, the tug is there to help it get safely to port and get the repairs it needs. So it's unfortunate, but I think that's just, that it was just the assumption that the vessel traffic route would be the way they say it would be in the application. They did all these studies for that vessel traffic route, and that's it. Yeah.
We have time for about one more question, then we can take it online. Brett?
Okay.
Someone's asking, would the requirements in House Bill 1652 apply to Canadian bound ships? And also, could you comment on any transboundary collaborations that are happening?
Great question. So the question is, would the bill that's in the state legislature right now that would require ships to use low sulfur fuels, would that apply to the ships going to and from Canada, Canadian ports? And then also asking if there's any transboundary coordination on this issue. Yeah. So as the legislation is currently written, it only applies to waters that Washington State has jurisdiction in. So it wouldn't apply to the ships in Canada. However, there was a recent comment opportunity with Transport Canada. If any of you are already Action Alert responders, you would have seen that and maybe sent in comments to Canada because they were asking for comments about scrubber use in Canadian waters. And so this is definitely a topic of concern that is being considered in Canada. It's being considered on both sides of the border. And in the ideal world, both sides of the border would address this issue and prohibit the use of scrubbers. Yeah. But as far as formal coordination on that project, on that part, I'm not aware of it, but I would hope that it is occurring. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much.